Carrie, the Chancellor is traveling.
Where?
China.
Oh, okay. No wonder why you're in demand.
Because afterwards I have to run to NTV for a TV commentary, and here I am.
Okay, so Eberhard Sandschneider, the former director of the German Council on Foreign Relations, the dean of the Department of Political Science at the Free University of Berlin, an expert on China, Taiwan. And you write a lot about how Europe just isn't keeping up with China. We're going to talk today a little bit about Ukraine, though. What does Ukraine have to do with Taiwan?
Nothing. That's our predisposition that China might do the same to Taiwan, what Putin does to Ukraine, but it's not connected. And it is highly unfeasible to assume that Xi Jinping will be as idiotic as Putin obviously is.
Okay, well, you just called me out because I've been saying, in terms of respect for international law, how our political system, our international system works, it's really important that Russia doesn't do this because China will. Now, you're saying that China won't do it because China is more rational?
Depends on how you define rationality. Well, China has been very, very clear, basically since the beginning of the 1970s. If we feel a little bit irritated by Xi Jinping's remarks during the party congress, including potential military action, but it is not new. China, in the beginning of the 1970s, published a Taiwan paper saying there are 3 reasons for war against Taiwan. One is a strategic cooperation between Taiwan and the Soviet Union. Well, Soviet Union gone, problem solved. Second one is major upheaval on the island, domestic upheaval on the island of Taiwan. Doesn't really happen. People are pretty happy with their democratic system there. And the last and final one is declaration of independence. And that is the major concern. So here comes the final answer. As long as no one is irritating China beyond the point of no return concerning the one China policy. Our Chancellor traveling to China today has just made it clear again in a big newspaper article, Germany will stick, as Europe will stick to the one China policy. And as long as Taiwan is not declaring independence, China will not go for military action. And on top of that, that's the political analysis, but if you look at the military component of this problem, I would be extremely careful seeing Russia's problems in Ukraine. My goodness, Taiwan's military is the best equipped and best trained military in all of Southeast Asia. And Taiwan is an island. That would mean a major amphibic operation, which is difficult to implement, certainly today, for China's military. What China could do is a kind of a military blockade of the island. Taiwan does have something what the Ukraine never had. Ukraine was not admitted to NATO, but Taiwan has a Taiwan Relations Act ever since 1979. Besides, there is an enormous amount of interdependence and cooperation between Taiwan and China. 500,000, some say even 600,000 Taiwanese have real estate in Shanghai alone. Most of Taiwan's producing companies have dependencies in southern China for obvious financial reasons. So the interconnection between the two, also family-wise and as far as the economy is concerned, is very intensive. That's not a 100% protection against a military incident, but, well, it's one of the reasons why people in Taiwan obviously are pretty much relaxed, even after the Pelosi visit and the military maneuver started.
Okay, but the same arguments you're using for why there wouldn't be a Chinese-Taiwan conflict can also be applied to Russia. Why did it make sense for Russia to attack Ukraine? Because if you look at what the Chinese military does, the Taiwanese military is constantly put under pressure, maintenance, fuel costs. They're constantly having to keep their planes in the sky because China keeps teasing them just a little bit, just keeps them on their toes, at an enormous cost for Taiwan. Why didn't Russia do that with Ukraine?
Because they are idiots. that's the simple version. That's the big surprise of this military adventure. It is an adventure. Looking at the performance of Russia's military, we are more than upset how bad their performance is. Unbelievable. We believe that this would be the second strongest army in the world. Look at them. If you question the logic, you have a good argument. There is no guarantee that it might not happen. The first question you have to ask yourself, is it plausible that China might attack Taiwan? I have given you the reasons in China's perspective. They still pretend the best version of all is peaceful unification. And some of us are joking, in Chinese, it's 和平统一. But there is also a 和平解放, that's peaceful liberation. Whatever that means. People in Hong Kong know what I'm talking about. So is it plausible that China is attacking Taiwan? Yes, it is. The Chinese keep saying these are the red lines. If you cross them, we will cross them too. But how should be expected to happen in the foreseeable future? That's a very low probability, but it is not a guarantee. And I have talked to Russian colleagues, experts, who told me on the evening of February 23rd, I would have bet all my money that he will not attack. And next morning, it happened. So this is the famous black swan developments do happen. And you have to have a president, like in the case of Putin, who is neglecting all economic aspects of the future of his country. He is driving out the best and the brightest of his country. He is ruining the economic perspectives of his country, possibly the future of his country. He's accepting thousands and thousands of people being killed on both sides, including his own soldiers. If you assume a similar idiot running China, you could have the same problem. The main difference is Xi Jinping is all but such an idiot as far as we can tell, but only as far as we can tell. There is no guarantee, once again, that it might not happen.
Someone just doesn't become an idiot overnight. You've said that Putin was an idiot and
Mhm.
unpredictable several times now. How do you explain then German foreign policy the past 20 years?
It was a reliable, cost-effective policy to buy Russian gas as cheap as possible. And well, even during the hard times, the hot times of the Cold War, Russia was a reliable supplier of resources. And that is the core element of this year's dramatic geopolitical change. And it's not only Russia, it is the United States, Kerry, sorry to say, turning one, or no, let me put it this way. There were three major elements of globalization, which are the basis of our welfare. We earned our money on that. We became rich on that. One is technology and technological innovation. Second one is free flow of finances around the globe. And the third is access to resources. And look, this is what's happening this year. The United States is turning chips into weapons against China, hoping the whole West is using blocking financial exchange with Russia in order to sanction Putin into perhaps changing his policy against Ukraine. And Russia itself is paying back by using resources, oil and gas, as a weapon against us. So all three major drivers of globalization, as we have seen it based on our own economic success, have been turned into weapons. That is the important change of this year, and that never happened before. And it was almost impossible to see that a politician like Putin would be willing to ruin his own country in order to implement one of his crazy dreams of a greater Russian empire on its way back to where the Soviet Union was. Difficult to foresee. And look, if one of our politicians 10 years ago would have said, no, we don't buy Russian gas, too dangerous, never try, never rely these Russians, everyone would have declared him crazy. Why don't you buy this cheap Russian gas? It's helping our economy to develop. So in hindsight, it is all so simple to see how things happened as they happened. But looking ahead, that's exactly your Taiwan question. Whatever will happen to Taiwan in 10 years, it will be very easy for me to explain to you why it happened.
You work as a political consultant, and you're often asked by companies to have a crystal ball. It's a thankless job in some ways, isn't it?
Yeah, you are, yes, it is to some extent, but you have to know your own the function you are serving. I'm a scapegoat. I meet people in companies who have an enormous experience, for example, in China. But when they suggest to their leaders, to their board, do it this way, they are running the risk that they might be proved wrong. So what they need is someone who's playing the scapegoat. And then they say, "Oh, this professor also told us that this is the right way to do it." So that's my function. But on the other hand, what I'm experiencing almost every day is a very serious concern on the top level of companies. They have questions and they are seeking solutions. Take this debate about dependencies in Germany, about the growing insecurity of supply chains, all these issues. It's enormously difficult for companies who over decades were used that the drivers of globalization, as we just discussed them, would be working and continue to work. And all of a
And
sudden, they're
available,
breaking
yeah.
down. So they really have, that's the difference between political consulting and business consulting. A politician listens to you and checks whether what you say is congruent with what he thinks or she thinks. And if it is the case, then he says, "Oh, I quote you. Otherwise, I won't talk to you anymore." But business people usually have serious concerns and decisions to make, and they have real questions. So what we do, we try to think in alternative futures. And argue if this happens, that might be the consequence. And if this happens, you should perhaps do that. Hedging is the most important aspect of business decisions these days. You just do not rely that the dependency on China will be as positive in your balance sheet as it was over the last 40 years. Might change rapidly from one day to the next. If something over Taiwan happens, the West will immediately have to sanction China the way we are sanctioning Russia. The big difference is China is a different kind of kid on the block, so to speak. China is the second largest economy in the world. Compare that to Russia and forget about if you take off gas and oil, where's Russia's economy? And the international importance of Russia's economy is almost non-existent. That would be dramatically different in the case of China. And that is, of course, a risk each and every company in Germany I'm talking to has a clear vision of and a great fear of.
Okay, let's go back to politicians because political ideologies have a lot to do with the decisions politicians make. And Germany was really slow to react to the situation in Ukraine. Do you attribute the reactions of Olaf Scholz's cabinet to the SPD and their ideology that stems from this idea that peace is the way forward, regardless at what cost?
It's perhaps even more complex. We have a government made up of ministers who don't even have a professional life before they started running this country. They had never finished studying any subject. They never had a professional experience. They never worked for a few years at least outside politics. It's a problem. If you have a minister of economics who is a professional author of children's books, and a foreign minister who never, ever had connection with serious and genuine foreign policy problems, and you push them into a situation where they have to make decisions, this is where you are ending up. The Chinese are laughing about that because they have a more or less meritocratic system, not necessarily to 100%, but in China, you have to prove that you are able to do the job before you get the job. In our system, you are starting a job and then you have to prove that you are able to live up to it. And that's a different kind of story if you are ending up in these complicated situations as we are in right now. But the misreading was not only a social democratic, unfortunately, I must say.
No, I was just going to say you just listed off two cabinet members that aren't even from the SPD. They're Greens.
No. I mean all parties, including the opposition parties.
Do you think the opposition party, the CDU, right now is in a very comfortable position? Because you could argue that a lot of the situation that Germany's in right now is because of their policies.
Yeah, that's the fate of those who win elections.
That's why the
They have
opposition's fun.
they have to live up to their new responsibilities wherever the problems are coming from. And basically, they, they don't have the time to even care because they have to meet the challenges of the day.
Now, before I can't use this recording, I have to kick my dog out of my office. Excuse me.
Okay.
Out, out.
Out.
I'm sorry about that.
But as an intervening third voice, that's quite interesting.
Oh yeah, she's got opinions about everything.
She has a political opinion, obviously.
You mentioned Nancy Pelosi. You talked about the United States' role. Do you think the situation in Ukraine would have been different in February if Donald Trump was still in the White House?
Oof. My guess is as good as anyone else's guess. I have no idea. Trump himself is pretending it would never have happened. I would have talked to Vladimir, but come on, who knows what Trump would have done? The United States in the past years did not pay too much attention to Russia's strategic positioning, very much to the anger of Mr. Putin. When Barack Obama described Russia as a regional power, I could imagine that Putin went wild inside the Kremlin and decided to teach him a lesson, so to speak. And the lesson came a little bit later. So for good reasons, the United States has been focusing on China and on trans-Pacific relations. And Europe seemed to be in a pretty stable and safe shape after all, after we won the Cold War. But that's a history, a lesson in hindsight. Each and everything we did was understandable at the time, but in the end, it was a mistake. It was understandable and a mistake to believe that democracy and market economy have won the first Cold War, and that's it. Now the others have to become like us. They don't have a choice because we have the model which is successful. And with this model, we won the Cold War. With two consequences. In the case of Russia, we thought, what? No need to even learn Russian. We abolished all our institutes of Slavonic studies and all major German universities, or at least cut them down, learning Russian. Ooh, why? These Russians will become like us anyway. And in the case of China, we added values and human rights and expected China to play according to our rules. The best example is Robert Zoellick. Many people in the United States will still remember him as the trade representative of the Bush administration. In 2007, he went to China, inviting China to become a responsible stakeholder. A great idea. The Chinese are responsible stakeholders. But the definition of responsibility is a Chinese one and not a Western one. And many of my American colleagues pretended that now, 10 years ago, now is the time to tell the Chinese what rules we expect them to follow, our rules, so that they know them when they are powerful enough to sit with us on the table. So the Chinese are defining their own rules, meanwhile, and we are struggling not to be forced to follow their rules. And even worse, our American friends, Kerry, have not learned the most important lesson. You do not sanction countries into following your prescriptions without empowering them to an extent which you wouldn't have believed. And the lesson could have been learned in the early 80s when Ronald Reagan started taxing Japanese car imports into the US. A few years later, they gave it up, and the Japanese car makers were much more formidable competitors to American car makers than before. A few days ago, the last module of Taigong was shot into space when the United States decided not to give access for data protection, for espionage, for whatever, to ISS. The Chinese decided to build such a bloody station themselves. And they're finishing it while we are speaking, basically. And the same will happen to TSMC and chip production. I would bet that in 5 years from now, and if not in 5 years, then in 10 years, and that is tomorrow in China's perspective, the Chinese will be able to produce the technologically leading chips in the world. They are forced to do it. They are forced because the United States is using, as I said, chips in order to keep China down. They don't have an option. They either give up and say, oh, sorry, we cannot compete anymore with the United States because we don't get access to these bloody chips, or they're building them themselves. For the time being, and that is the most important aspect, never forget, if you, with any statement about China, comparing China with the United States, Europe, the rest of the world, never forget to add for the time being. That is an important qualification. For the time being, the US has 16 carrier groups. China has 2. And in 10 years, well, they might be up to 10 or 12. And even today, the Seventh Fleet is not as secure as it used to be due to naval capacities the Chinese are building step by step. The Chinese expression is ibu, one step after the other. And that is the secret behind their whole development over the last 40 years. And step by step, try to improve their own global positioning, like it or not. And the big question is the American reaction. And even since you started with Ukraine, one of my best American friends, professor at Georgetown University, he said a simple sentence to me about, you know, Ohio is more important than Luhansk. So who will be the next president of the US is one of the most decisive questions, not only for the West and the ability to agree in a transatlantic context, but also for the way the US is reacting towards China. And the baseline there is for the future of the peace in this world.
How do you feel about the inclusion or exclusion of countries from these multilateral organizations?
Well, multilateralism in that sense is dead for the time being, because multilateralism is built on a very, very simple assumption. Everyone who is taking part in multilateral activities has to accept the rules of the game. And quite obviously, Russia is not accepting the rules of the game anymore. And the big question is, will China in the future? Who knows? But if I'm trying to play chess with you and you try to play Go with me, that won't work. So if you are not finding common ground in the way you cooperate, and that is a very, very simple rule. International relations is not as complicated as it sometimes seems. Cooperation only works if everyone is willing to cooperate. And one party is saying, no, not with me, cooperation will break down or end in a stalemate or whatever. And this is what you can see in many international institutions. The WTO was blocked because the United States under Trump didn't want to follow the rules anymore. The World Health Organization was blocked because China did not want to be criticized more than necessary for the outbreak of the pandemic. Look at the European Union. Even these days, our Chancellor is expected by some of these wonderful voices to take a European perspective. I'm not sure whether he knows what a European perspective is towards China. My reading is that there are dozens of European perspectives on China, but but Europe is certainly not speaking with one voice or defining one position against anything. Take Mr. Orban or our friends in Poland and compare, well, not to mention our Brits. They are out of the game to some extent, but they are still an important player in Europe. So this is the baseline of international cooperation, and this is under pressure and in question these days. That is one of the genuine risks of our time. unimaginable 10 years, 15 years, 20 years ago, and certainly unimaginable after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But we believe that we won the Cold War, and now the time of democracy and modernization has come.
I was sitting in your classes at that time. We were talking about these new paradigms. Looking
Mm.
back at what we've learned now and the mistakes that were made, how would you suggest that people move forward?
Yeah, the most important problem is that we, as I take off my glasses and put them on again, what we have in front of our eyes, on our nose, is a value-based glasses. That's easy because we know what our values are. But looking at the world as it is and understanding someone else with a different set of values, that's the important thing. And if you are arguing with China in the perspective of human rights, it's absolutely easy. They are violating human rights. They have to be criticized. But the problem is, we are criticizing them for not reaching minimal standards of a value system they even don't want to reach. That's not their system. They are not aiming at meeting our expectations concerning values. So we are always talking criticism based on an illusion. And we do not care enough to learn about the interests of the other side. And in hindsight, we might even be able to see that in the case of Russia. We would have been well advised in hindsight if we would have allowed Russia a little bit more to share its interests with us, to put it mildly. Maybe it would have even prevented this war as it is going on. Who knows? That's guessing in hindsight. But the same will apply to China, and the same will apply to many other nations who have their own perspectives. Think of the whole greater Middle East, of India, of South Africa. These days we are watching Brazil with a very, very narrow outcome in what we regard in our favor. But that's not yet a solution. That's too close to call, so to speak. And who knows what the domestic situation in Brazil will be in a few months from now. So there are many different developments going on in this respect. A little bit more competence about the rest of the world in an ever more globally connected world would be an enormous helpful instrument.
No, you talk about having to accept that there's different values and different ways of measuring things, but there does seem to be some commonalities happening right now. This very close outcome in Brazil, the election in Israel, the conservatives in Poland. What explains that right now?
Here we come to the core problem, which has nothing to do with values, I would argue. If you look at democracies, the most important element in a democracy is trust. If you go to the ballots next Tuesday, you trust that the politician or the party you're voting for will do what you expect them, him, her, to do over the next 4 years. Without trust, there's no democracy. In China, it's completely different. The core element of Chinese politics is control, and always was control. And here comes the dramatic difference. An ever more accelerating complexity makes it difficult for people to understand the world they're living in. And it makes it very easy for people with simple solutions to pretend that they know how to solve the problems on the left and on the right. That's what you see in Israel, in Poland, in Hungary, in Brazil, in the United States, in Germany, if you look at our AfD phenomenon, for example. So trust is decreasing as the core substance of democracy, while on the other hand, the ability and the capacity to control is improving in the case of China due to technological change. Xi Jinping is using face recognition software. Does anyone believe that his two predecessors would not have used it if they only had it? It didn't exist. I never forget, it's 15 years since iPhone came on our markets. And how did this one technology change the way we are communicating? So while the ability to control is improving, the ability of trust is decreasing, and that is one of the big challenges in the world of today.
That was a
Okay.
really, really great
Yep,
explanation.
that
And
was a big one, right?
it's almost like you do this professionally.